as with Alan, I feel very privileged to be able to speak this afternoon, and thank you to Michael and to Nigel for hosting this event. It's very, very good. Michael asked Alan and myself to do a Morecambe and Wires event. It's not going to be quite like that, but at least there's going to be a little bit of overlap between the two of us, because we overlapped at Aberystwyth, as Alan mentioned. I started working with Edward Nevin, or Ted as he was known to all of us, in the summer of 1965, when I joined what was then the Economic Research Unit in Aberystwyth as a research assistant. I recall being interviewed by George Clayton and Ted Nevin in the department in Laura Place. I remember that occasion very well. I felt incredibly daunted by that experience. There is Laura Place. Can you see it? It's there, number one. That was the Department of Economics. In fact, the Economic Research Unit occupied the whole of a building called Pen Roc, as Alan has mentioned, on the prom, and it was just opposite the pier, as you may well know. And both the Economics Department and the ERU was due to move to a new home in the Llandinam Building on the main site within just a few months. Now that's Pen Roc as it is now. It's now a fish and chip restaurant. At that time, the ERU used to occupy the whole building. So there were 7 or 8 people in the group, as I recall it. And the participants in the group actually worked on a very wide range of topics. It was very active under Ted's leadership, and there was a very warm and friendly and collegial atmosphere. I was hired to work with Ted and along with Alan Roe on the social accounts project, and my primary job was to implement an input-output model for the Welsh economy, which was actually Ted's brilliant idea. It was his own idea that he wanted to implement. The project was well underway when I joined. I'd got no previous experience of compiling social accounts or of input-output, although unusually for the time, I did have some useful background in both areas from my undergraduate studies at Nottingham. I'd studied mathematics and economics from my first degree, and moreover, I'd subsequently learned how to write computer programs in Fortran 4. Clearly, these were going to be useful skills which I could contribute to the project. Ted's sharp intellect and enthusiasm for the project were really obvious from the start. For me, it was a truly inspiring experience. Ted, with Alan's assistance, had come up with some very clever uses of data and some imaginative ways of generating the social accounts for Wales. The estimates were largely built on earlier work by Ted with the earlier team that Alan has mentioned, with George Peters and others. These were published in books which should come up. There we are. Well, they're booklets, really. Number 1 was published in 56, and number 2 was published in 57. And they were the early work on the social accounts. Now, during that first summer in Pen Roc, I do also recall my arrival coincided with Ted taking his young family on a holiday abroad. Was it a camping holiday in Europe? Family members might remember. Anyway, a very large American car had been purchased for the occasion, the likes of which had never been seen in Aberystwyth before. It arrived outside of Pen Roc. Quite a spectacle. Ted certainly liked large statement cars, because for instance, not too long afterwards, after the move to the Llandinam Building, he bought a brand new blue Jaguar. and went across to Coventry to collect it. I do remember that very well. Okay, so we moved up to the Llandinam Building, and that's a picture of the building was taken just about the time that we moved up. And the economics department occupied mainly the first floor of that building. Now let me say a little bit more about my work with him. My main work during 65-66, 60 years ago, remember? Hard to believe. My main work was to help to construct an input-output table for Wales and to carry out some associated modelling work. So the first question is perhaps, what is or what was meant by the Welsh input-output table? Not everybody may know that. For those of you who do not know, it's quite simply a statistical picture of the structure of production in Wales. It shows the interrelationships between different industries or sectors of production, plus the use of final goods and services and the generation of income by sector. And importantly, it showed the detailed structure of the interrelationship in terms of flows of goods and services between Wales and the rest of the United Kingdom. Statistical and analytical techniques have moved on quite considerably in the last 60 years, but at that time this was all quite innovative. Nothing quite like it had ever been done in the UK before, let alone for the Welsh economy. Our work, which was with Ted and with Alan, involved making visits to 5 or 6 major establishments in Wales that were representative of the key industries, coal, steel and so on. But for the most part we relied on a huge amount of data and, importantly, some simplifying assumptions. Constructing the table was one thing, but the aim of the input-output model was to capture the secondary effects of impacts of changes in the demands for output from one industry on all the others. This was Ted's objective in a Welsh economy context. The work of turning the statistical base into a working economic model involved writing and implementing a computer program, and in particular to invert a 62 square matrix. It's very hard to relate this now, or for anyone to fully understand the limitations on what was possible then. Remember, analogous development to computers was TVs. At that time, many of us were used to TVs with 12-inch black and white screens based on cathode ray tubes. And they had operated from one control button called an on-off switch. Against that background, at that time we'd just seen mainframe computers transitioning from paper tape input to punch cards, and the Aberystwyth computer itself was simply not capable of performing the operations needed for our model. So, as with many other researchers at Aber, we would send our work in the form of boxes of punch cards to be run on the Atlas computer at Harwell in Oxfordshire. On quite a few occasions I travelled to Harwell to carry out several programme runs overnight. This was a far more efficient way of doing it. And occasionally Alan and I travelled there together. And on one of those occasions, and much to Ted's subsequent amusement, I managed to drop a box of punch cards containing probably 700 or so cards as I handed them in to computer reception.
At 2 o'clock in the morning?
Yes, indeed, very early in the morning. This meant a very long night for both of us, so we could sort these cards into an order, correct order to resubmit. So there were amusing times that we can look back with amusement now. As Alan mentioned, Gwynfor Evans visited the department in 1966, probably around the time he became the first Plaid Cymru MP for Carmarthen. Ted was very keen to show him the input-output table. This was something he was very pleased and proud of, which by then was represented on one very large piece of paper. So he had this very important visitor, it's Ted, Nevin, Alan and myself, and the only way we could see this piece of paper in comfort was to spread it out on Ted's office floor. So I have this vivid memory of the four of us kneeling on the floor around this table with this VIP amongst them. Okay, so the next slide is in fact what Alan has just shown you, is the publication. Ted's main objective was to use the input-output table, or model rather, to generate projections of output and employment for Wales alongside those for the UK as a whole that had been published in the UK National Plan. The UK projections had been produced using a much more complex but essentially similar model for the UK constructed by the Department of Applied Economics at Cambridge. In our publication and in the separate document prepared for the Welsh Economic Council, the words prediction and forecast were used, whereas what we actually produced were projections. There's quite a subtle but important difference between the terminology, but I do notice, looking back in that publication, those words come out, and it does frighten you a little bit that they were deemed to be forecasts. We did attempt to subject the model to some tests against simple alternative projection methods, mainly straight line extrapolation. And as would be expected, the input-output model did rather better at picking up the spillover effects of changes in the primary sectors on all other sectors, as this is what the model was designed to do. Now, my final part is to say a little bit more about Ted Nevin as a professor and departmental head. Because in 1966, I became a lecturer in the economics department, mainly teaching econometrics. Initially, therefore, my relationship on this was more with George Clayton, who was still head of department and hence my line manager. But I continued to have a lot to do with Ted because my own subsequent research on the model was ongoing. At that time, economics was becoming more mathematical and quantitative subject. That is, a revolution in teaching the subject was underway. Ted had grasped this particular nettle, and around that time he drafted a microeconomics textbook using a more mathematical approach and learning new tricks as he went along. So he was never too old to learn. Ted also did his best to foster and encourage research in the department more generally. His interests were always quite broad. There were regular staff seminars held jointly with the Agricultural Economics Department. Ted was always very active participant in these seminars. Often intense and sometimes quite heated arguments arose. Ted was never passive in these exchanges. He argued robustly. Afterwards, most times, we would end up at the Crystal Palace pub and for a beer or two, and all would be well. I've got a photograph of the economics department at Aberystwyth in 1966, just at the point I joined, because my predecessor is still there. But there you see George Clayton and Ted Nevin on the front row. What strikes me is that's the final year undergraduate group, mainly on the back row, mainly male, very few females in the final year, and most people wearing ties. Quite a few changes. Perhaps I should also mention that as well as his academic activities throughout my time at Aber, Ted Nevin was also active with broadcasting and advisory work. He was a frequent guest on BBC radio and TV with people like Vincent Kane and Patrick Hannon and others, broadcasting in programmes like T-Junction, Good Morning Wales, Wales Today, etc. His sharp intellect and eloquence made him a very popular person with the general public in Wales. George Clayton left in 1967 and Ted assumed the role of head of department. This was his final year at Aber, and it was mine too. Ted was a very fair head of department. He was intensely hard working, and without question he led by example. It was a year of significant change in the college. Several prominent professors at the college decided to leave at around that time, so it should not have been a surprise to any of us that in 1968 Ted also decided to leave Aberystwyth and move to Swansea.